Some 40 world leaders in Jerusalem to mark the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland by the Soviets. This was at the tail end of World War II. Some 100 of the last Israeli survivors on hand. Hugo Royer has more.
Projecting a united front for the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, a stellar list of international leaders descended on Jerusalem for the World Holocaust Forum, aiming to speak with one voice amid fears anti-Semitism is on the rise.
What starts with the hatred of the Jews doesn't end with the Jews. Represented here today are governments that understand that confronting anti-Semitism in all its forms protects their societies as well.
When anti-Semitism appears, all forms of racism proliferate, all divisions spread, and no one comes out of this as a winner.
There was one notable absence, the president of Poland, home to the biggest Nazi death camp. Andrzej Duda boycotted the 5th edition of the forum in protest at leaders from countries whose governments had collaborated with the German occupiers being invited to speak, while he was not. Duda had recently been engaged in a war of words with Russia's president, who'd been fending off criticism of the Soviet Union's pre-war pact with the Nazis. The Russian leader has shifted the blame on Poland and other former Soviet states for the outbreak of World War II.
Memories of the Holocaust will only become a lesson and a warning if the full story is told. Regrettably, right now the memory of war and its lessons are increasingly falling victim to political interests.
Poland will host its own event at Auschwitz next week. Israel has also invited President Duda to come and speak at another event.
And following for us, our correspondent Iris Machler. Iris, what was your standout moment in that ceremony?
The speech that moved me the most, that actually moved me to tears, was the speech of the German president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier. And the reason, it was a beautifully crafted speech. It began with the Hebrew prayer, the blessing, that God has blessed me to reach this day. And then he said, how would that be? I am a German. We did this. It was Germans, the nation that I lead, that killed 6 million people, that began this war, that killed 50 million people. He said, how would I be happy to be here today? And he said, the reason is I stand here bowed with guilt, but buoyed up by the thought of reconciliation, because there is a relationship, there are hands stretched out from survivors to Germans since the end of World War II. There's a burgeoning relationship between Israel and Germany. There's a growing Jewish community inside Germany. And he said all those things are encouraging to me. But it wasn't just hopeful. He did acknowledge that there is growing anti-Semitism in Germany once again, how terrible it was that there was that shooting at a synagogue on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar in a German city last year. But he said, I stand for hope against the abyss and against hatred, and it was very moving.
Yeah, one notable absentee among all those leaders present, which was the Polish leader. He stayed away because he wasn't given a chance to speak, he says, at the rostrum, whereas he was angry that not Germany's president, but Russia's president was given a voice.
Yes, there's this diplomatic conflict, if you like, between Russia and Poland so many decades after World War II about the causes of World War II. And because of that, when the Polish president heard that the Russian president was speaking, he demanded the right to speak too. And when Yad Vashem wouldn't grant that to him, they said the ceremony was long enough, they wanted victor nations to speak alongside Germany. Then when he wasn't granted that right, he said, that's it, I'm not coming, I'm boycotting this. So really it is the spat between Russia and Poland, which is it was very interesting to hear Vladimir Putin's speech, because he didn't mention Poland by name, but he did say during his speech, he spoke about the horrors of the Holocaust, and he said, but the Nazis didn't do it alone. They had collaborators who were sometimes often more cruel than their masters. And you can read that as a reference to Poland. And part of this whole historical reassessment is whether or not there was any Polish collaboration with the Nazis, particularly regarding the Jews, which the present-day Polish government denies.
All right, not all the arguments about history, present-day tensions getting a nod, particularly when the U.S. Vice President spoke. Let's listen.
We must be prepared to confront and expose the vile tide of anti-Semitism that is fueling hate and violence all across the world, and we must stand together. In that same spirit, we must also stand strong against the leading state purveyor of anti-Semitism, against the one government in the world that denies the Holocaust as a matter of state policy and threatens to wipe Israel off the map. The world must stand strong against the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Mike Pence was not alone, Iris Mockler.
No, he was not. Earlier, when Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gave his speech, it was mostly centred on the Holocaust, and then he too mentioned Iran. It was very interesting. I have heard some reaction from Israeli commentators who say that was not appropriate in this situation. This is looking backwards at Europe. It's a commemoration 75 years ago of the Holocaust and what happened there. It's a looking today at anti-Semitism in Europe, and that it isn't appropriate to bring in this political issue, however justified you might feel and however important you might feel it is, that kind of politics didn't have a place here. But there were cheers from the crowd, so obviously people in the crowd don't agree with all the commentators.
Iris Mockler in Jerusalem. Many thanks for that update. And for more, let's go to Charleston, South Carolina. Joshua Shane's Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at the College of Charleston. It's interesting, the argument over who gets to speak, over what to talk about, still front and center at that commemoration. By the way, there's going to be a second commemoration, with the one that's going to be taking place Monday at the Auschwitz concentration camp itself. Your thoughts on how the 75th anniversary is being commemorated?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. It seems to me that William Faulkner's famous expression that the past is never dead, it's not even past, seems to be verified over and over again. The politics of the Holocaust 75 years later is still so dominant. And the truth is, it's coming from all quarters. So on the one hand, you have Russia, which is rewriting history to deny its own role in the start of World War II with the agreement with Hitler from 39 to 41. And then you have Poland, which is rightfully outraged at the suggestion that they started World War II, which is what Russia has said. But at the same time, they're suppressing research into Polish participation in the Holocaust. They've passed legislation that has criminalized teaching that Poles were involved with the killing of Jews. It led to actually a very rare spat between Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Israel, and the Israeli government, because the Israeli government sort of went along with that line, and Yad Vashem said, this is crazy, this is historical revisionism, we can't allow this. So there's a lot of, and all around, there's a lot of tensions going on about this, and it's sort of hard for me to pick a side to say you're right or you're right.
Why did the Israeli government go along with it?
Well, Israeli government right now tends to be supportive of regimes that are supportive of the Greater Israel Project in the West Bank. And that means that Netanyahu is going to work with, for example, the Orban government in Hungary, despite the fact that the Orban government is promoting openly anti-Semitic ideas. It's going to work with the right-wing Polish government. It's going to work with the Freedom Party in Austria. It's going to work, frankly, with the Trump administration, despite the fact that the Trump administration has had some really problematic policies and statements regarding Jews and others. Its promotion, its equation for the last couple of years of anti-Semitism with anti-Israel, and not just anti-Israel, but anti-Semitism with opposition to the right-wing Israeli policies, from my perspective, is problematic, but it's going to drive their politics very much. You know, just last week at Davos, at the World Economic Forum, the White House here in America had given credentials to a so-called news station that openly promotes outright anti-Semitism, talking about a Jew coup leading the impeachment inquiry, talking about a Jewish conspiracy coming after Christians, and they were credentialed at this event last week. This is here in the United States, so to speak, in our White House. So I think, in general, the Netanyahu regime has a very realpolitik approach. If you support his regime, if you support his policies, then you are on the side of the Jews, and if you oppose them, then you're not. And this is a big part of what's happening.
Some 40 leaders in attendance in Jerusalem. Joshua, what is the meaning of the ceremony we witnessed earlier, and what's the meaning of the one that we'll be covering here, by the way, on France 24 on Monday from the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland?
Well, the Holocaust has deep, deep meaning in Israel. It's hard to overstate. It's in the Declaration of Independence. Israel, of course, is a national movement that cites 3,000 years of Jewish history in the land. But it really, you know, having been born just after the Holocaust, it's always felt the destruction very deeply. On Holocaust Remembrance Day, the entire country shuts down for several minutes and stops while the sirens blare. It's incredibly important. And it's very controversial. It's increasingly controversial, as your reporter just said. Sometimes it's being used for political purposes, referring to Iran as the new sort of Hitler, or the new Nazi threat. And others say this is ridiculous. You can't use history in this way. In terms of what happens in Auschwitz, we'll see. I actually didn't see the full list of who will be attending. I know this is what Poland is pushing. Poland's line with Auschwitz has always been that it was a German. All 6 death camps were built on Polish territory. They were death camps built to murder Jews, to carry out the final solution against Jews. Poles were killed, non-Jewish Poles were killed there as well, and others. Roma, for example, a lot of Roma were killed as part of a genocide against the Roma population. But they were designed to kill Jews overwhelmingly. And Poland, through most of its history, has sort of turned Auschwitz into a site of Polish resistance and Polish suffering. And that's very controversial. As a matter of fact, there's a famous case of a church on Auschwitz grounds that's always been very controversial because it's sort of part of the effort to appropriate Auschwitz as a site of Polish suffering. There's no question that non-Jewish Poles were killed there, and there's also no question that it was a German camp. Germany has always been quite open about this fact. But it was a site of Jewish death, overwhelmingly, with some Polish complicity. That Poland is having a hard time accepting, I think.
And Joshua Shanes, when you're sitting in Charleston, South Carolina, what's the significance of this 75th anniversary?
Also in the diaspora, also in South Carolina, Holocaust remembrance is extremely important. You know, it's funny, on our central square here in Charleston, before there was a monument to African-American slavery, and Charleston was the major port of importing African slaves. There was a Holocaust memorial. Charleston built a Holocaust memorial on its central square quite a few years ago as part of an effort to commemorate that event. And I think both Jews and non-Jews look at it, you know, from an American perspective, it's something that we can unambiguously address as a horror to condemn that we didn't commit, so to speak, as a nation. We certainly have a conflicted history. I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Oh, great. So from Charleston's perspective, it's something we can sort of commemorate as the good guys, as it were. Now, it's a little bit conflicted because America blocked immigration of Jewish refugees. But that aside, you know, it was likewise on the Washington Mall. America built the Holocaust Memorial and Historical Museum of Research before it built the Museum to African American Heritage. There's something about the Holocaust that allows us to commemorate this human suffering in a way that's, I think, safer and less complicated than it would be in Germany or in Poland or in Israel even.
Joshua Shanes, Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at the College of Charleston. Many thanks for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to come back anytime.